The heat had a taste to it, a copper tang like blood turned to vapor, and it pressed across the field with the suffocating weight of a hand over a mouth. Jon could feel it on the back of his neck, prickling beneath damp hair, feel it in the tightness in Ghost's body as the direwolf paced at his side, white fur-limbed gold by the dying light. The grasses of the Rose Road were blackened to brittle stalks. Wagons and broken axles lay like rib bones thrust from ash. Men knelt in ranks with their heads bowed while Dothraki riders circled them on nervous horses, and overhead the dragon coasted on wind made by its own enormous wings, turning in a lazy wheel that still dragged every gaze up, always up. Daenerys stood in the smoking ruin with her hair twisting in the hot breeze and the sun at her back like a second crown. Her face was set, the long bones of it carved into resolve. Tyrion stood near her shoulder, one hand to shade his eyes, his mouth drawn tight in thought. The prisoners, Lannister red, Tarly green, battered scraps of cloth and scorch marks, waited for judgment. Jon had seen battlefields before. He had seen mounds of frozen dead and the way men looked when they knew they would be dead by nightfall. But the dragon changed the air itself. It made the world feel younger and more terrible at once. He could not keep his eyes from Daenerys, nor from the lank, stubborn figure among the kneeling who had refused to budge when asked to rise and bow. "Randall Tarly," Tyrion called out for the third time, breathless from smoke and shouting. "Lord of Horn Hill, step forward." The old soldier did not step. He lifted his chin and held his ground. Next to him a younger man, broad-shouldered, fear in his eyes, glanced from father to queen, then stood too, with an instinct as simple as a tide chasing the moon. "Dickon Tarly," someone murmured, and Jon watched how Daenerys measured them both, watched the quick flash in her eyes, the flicker of consideration warring with her need to be seen as fire made flesh. She spoke, and even her voice seemed to strike sparks. "Kneel, and you may live to serve a better world. Stand, and be burned away with the old." It should have been simple. Here, justice had the shape of a dragon and mercy the color of ash. The Dothraki murmured and jostled. Grey Worm stood silent and still among a neat rank of Unsullied, who had marched hard through the day to be on this field. Jon felt the pull of the moment like a rope around his chest, tightening with each breath. Randall Tarly's mouth flattened. He had the look of a man who had never bent the knee except to the gods, and perhaps not even then. "I have a queen," he said, voice carrying more clearly than his lean frame seemed able to produce. "I have a duty to the realm as I see it. I will not kneel to a foreign invader." "Father?" Dickon said, and in that one word Jon heard a son scrambling for some ledge between honor and life. He thought of Robb, of the stubborn tilt of his brother's head, and the rope in his chest drew tighter. "Bring them forward," Daenerys said. Drogon landed like the fall of night. Wind hammered the ash into whirls and sent scattered flames leaping. Jon stepped without thinking, his boots crunching charcoal. Ghost kept pace, a pale ripple of muscle. He knew the logic of it. He knew what the sight of mercy would do to harden the mistrust of lords who already thought her too soft, too foreign. He knew what fear could accomplish in a half-fractured realm. It did not matter. Something older than logic, something the cold had carved into him, raised his voice before he was entirely in control of it. "Your Grace," he said, and the words cut across the field. "If you must kill them to show strength, then do it with your sword. Look into their faces. Hear their names. Don't pretend it's the dragon deciding." Daenerys turned her head so slowly he could count heartbeats between each degree. Sweat ran down Jon's spine, tracing the faint old scars there. Tyrion went quiet, the small movements of his hands stilled. "This is not your decision, King in the North," Daenerys said, each word clean and cold despite the heat. There was a tremor beneath it he did not know how to read. "No," Jon agreed. "It is yours, and the realm will take its measure of you by it." He moved nearer, low with ash and heat, until he could see the strain at the corner of her eyes. They marched because they were commanded, most of them. They fought for the man they were told was their commander's ally, for oaths that bound them since boyhood. "We can burn every lord who refuses you." We can roast every son who stands beside him to keep him from dying afraid. And then what will be left to rule but cinders and salt?" She stared at him, her mouth opened, shut. Tyrion spoke into the slip of silence like a wedge, quick and soft. "There are centuries of custom that allow condemned men to take the black. Lord Randall is no common cutpurse, but the Night's Watch is not particular about the blood they keep from spilling. The old ways have a usefulness here." Randall laughed, short and sharp, indignation more than mirth. "The Night's Watch? For me? You would make a crow of me, dwarf?" "You would live," Jon said, turning his face to the man who had disowned one son and led the other to a fire's mouth. "And you would hold a wall that guards everyone from a threat none of you have had cause to believe in. You want duty? There it is. The oldest duty there is." Randall's stare was a blade. "You left that duty," he said. "I kept it," Jon answered. "We are all keeping it in our ways." He let the moment bite. "And you will hear no word from me against a man who does his duty at last." Dickon touched his father's arm. Randall did not shake him off. To watch a man weigh pride and love was to hear bone grind against bone. Jon saw Daenerys watching too, the minutes softening at the corners of her mouth when Dickon's eyes found hers. She knew the geometry of sons and fathers. Perhaps it was memory in her that relented. "I will not be seen as weak," she said finally, but the iron in it lacked its original edge. "I will not be Cersei's shadow, blowing smoke and calling it fire." The dragon hissed. A breeze twitched the black grass. Jon could smell his own sweat, smoke, leather, the faint clean scent of ghost's fur. "Then make a law," Jon said. "Not a pyre." She turned her face up to the dragon, to the sky beyond it. He watched the moment settle through her like sand through a glass. When she spoke again, her voice had the cadence of proclamation. "Randall Tarly, Dickon Tarly, and the men of their host," she said. "By right of conquest and the judgment that belongs to me, I spare your lives. You may take the black, and serve where oaths are not broken for sport. Those who will not take the black may swear fealty to me and be paroled, under watch, under bond. Those who will neither swear nor serve will be kept until ransomed. You will lay down your swords and submit to the custody of my army now, whole and without deceit. If you rise, you burn." Some of the Dothraki muttered in disappointment, in grudging respect, in confusion. Grey Worm did not react at all. Jon thought the eunuch's thoughts were iron on iron, duty hammering duty. Randall Tarly's jaw worked, a tendon jumping like a living thing, and then it quit. He bowed his head without kneeling. Dickon exhaled, as if he had not known he'd been holding breath since dawn. "Your grace," Randall said. There was no grace in it, only something emptied of everything except will. "I will take the black." Dickon swallowed. He looked wholly young for a heartbeat, as if the soot on his cheek were dirt from some childhood tumble. "If my father goes, then I go," he said. The words were very low. "I swore my sword to the crown he served. I'll keep it for the realm instead." "You don't have to," Daenerys said before Jon could speak, an odd softness he had not expected stealing into her voice. "You were not lord. Your oaths were as much your father's as your own." Dickon straightened. There was a steadiness to him Jon had not looked for and found all the more striking for it. "My word belongs to me," he said. "I will know I kept it." "You will keep it for me?" Daenerys said then, like a current swerving around rock. Jon turned, surprised. She went on without looking at him. "I will borrow your sword until it belongs to the Night's Watch. You know these roads. You know the way the Lannisters send their wagons, how they gather men when pressed. Your men will be paroled into my service under your command and under the watch of my Unsullied. You will harry, not slaughter. Grain, bridges, fords. When you have split the Lannister lines and broken the path to King's Landing, you may go to the wall with honor. Serve me to serve the realm." Dickon's gaze darted to his father, to Jon, to the dragon. If there was boyhood left in him, it straightened into a man as the silence stretched. He bowed his head like his father had, and when he looked up, he looked older. "As you command," he said. "For the realm." Randall's eyes were knives. "You will answer to me, boy, until your vows are said," he murmured, raw with something Jon did not have to name. "Leave no man unaccounted for. Don't let them shame you into cruelty you'll hate later." "Then bend," Dickon said very softly, more plea than instruction. Randall's head bent a fraction further, the old soldier learning the shape of a new obedience like a badly healed bone learns the weather. "Mind the fords on the Blackwater," he said. "The current eats at the eastern banks. Your horse will lie to you about what sand can hold." Dickon nodded once, and that was all. By dusk, the field of ashes had a different weight in the air, the weight of a choice given shape. The men surrendered swords. The Dothraki rode out to encircle wagons. An unsullied detachment placed the Tarly men under guard. Drogon's shadow made the smoke leap over the field and then settled as the dragon folded in on itself near its queen, a mountain deciding to be only stone. Jon stood a moment longer before he went to Daenerys. "You did the harder thing," he said. Ghost pressed against his thigh, impatient with standing in heat that had no scent of snow. "Men will see that. Men will see a queen who was moved by a man who has never bent a knee to her," Daenerys returned. There was no bitterness in it, only a truth worn smooth by repeated thought. When she lifted her eyes to him, they were not the eyes of the dragon but a woman's eyes in doubt and in need of answer. "Did you intend to make me choose your counsel over my justice? It is a dangerous intimacy, this convincing. I intend to make you—" When they reached Dragonstone, the sea gave its pep talk to the rocks with its old steady tongue. Wind hounded them up. The steep approach. The smell of smoke clung to them all despite hours between ash and salt air. Jon stood at the painted table with Daenerys, Tyrion, and Missandei, with Grey Worm and Yora and the map that pretended the world could be tamed by paint and thought. "Cersei's hold is not merely a city. It is a set of arteries," Tyrion said, small hands listing points along the river lines like the enumerations of prayer. "The Rose Road feeds her, the Gold Road fattens her, and the Blackwater carries breath into King's Landing. If we sever and turn them, we can bleed her slowly, piece by piece, until she is too light to fight. This is a harvest war as much as a war of flags," Missandei put in, voice mild as rain. "If the small folk can eat, they are less likely to throw stones or burn your carts when you pass." "The small folk will do as they must," Grey Worm said. "But if we cut the fords and take the grain stores along the Rose Road, Cersei's men will scatter their strength to guard many places and be weak in each." Jon leaned into the table, hands braced on cool, sanded wood. "Dickon says the Lannisters favor crossing at Stonehelm Ford when they don't want the Blackwater's ferries," he said. "We can make that crossing a trap. If we strike there, then again west where the Rose Road leaves the Mander Valley, we can force them to choose which wound to cover." Daenerys traced a finger along the painted river, pausing over the curve like the neck of some shy beast. "You will not burn the fords," she said. "No dragons. We take and hold and destroy what we must. But the city will see smoke rising and think it is theirs, and rumor travels faster than the truth." Yora frowned. "A double-pronged advance requires coordination we have not yet tested with newly paroled men." Jon thought of the ghost of a boy in a lord's body, staring at a dragon and choosing to be a man. "Dickon will hold his line," he said, "and the Unsullied will steady what needs steadying." Tyrion was already thinking through the practicalities of water and wagons. "If we move at night, we can be at Stonehelm by dawn," he said. "Grey Worm, take your detachment and 200 of the Tarly men. Send scouts ahead with orders to leave the ferries intact but change their moorings so the current carries them into our hands. Jon, you move west with the Dothraki, Yora, and Dickon himself. You'll strike the Rose Road crossing at Willowhith, burn the stores there, and scatter the guards." "Scatter, not slaughter," Daenerys reminded, and her voice brooked no argument. "We're not a plague. We're a storm, and storms pass." Jon nodded. It sat well with him, the way a sword sits well in the hand of the person it was forged for. They left that night under a cloudless sky, stars burning as if they had never seen smoke, as if the world beneath them did not burn as matter of course wherever men were involved. Ghost ran ahead, disappearing and reappearing along the edges of the path like a thought he could not quite catch. Dickon Tarley rode not far from John's stirrup, his jaw set, his hands sure on his reins. He carried himself like a man wearing a hair shirt no one else could see. "You spoke for us?" he said after a long while in which the creak of leather and the hiss of sand under hooves were the only sounds. "Thank you for that." "I spoke for the realm," John said. The words were blunt and cost him nothing. "But I am glad your father lives. Sam is a friend." Dickon started, nearly missing a beat in his horse's step. "Sam." "Your brother," John said gently. He remembered Sam's panic in the snow, his stubbornness at the top of the world. He remembered the heavy sword he had helped Sam steal and the way Sam had smiled like a boy when he had made up his mind to be a thief. "He saved my life at the wall. He is braver than he thinks." Dickon let out a breath John had not known he was listening for. "He was always not like us," he said. There was affection in it now, not the scorn John had heard in Randall's short bark in the ashes. "I thought my father would kill him for taking that sword. He might yet try to take it back," John said, and grimaced at himself for how his mouth twisted. "Sam has left the citadel. He is coming north. He may already be at Winterfell." He thought how this disclosure might ripple, but secrecy had poisoned too many things already. Dickon was quiet for a time, then said in a voice scraped bare, "I would like to see him live long enough to be angry with me." "You can't choose the weather," John said. "Only your cloak against it." They reached Willowhithe in the hour before dawn and found it half asleep and half braced. Guards clutching spears with eyes already red from smoke they smelled long before it arrived. The Dothraki rode silent and swift along the hedgerows. Unsullied hands loosened the ropes at the ferry house while Dickon placed his men at the lanes leading down to the water. The first clash was a stuttering of steel and breath and then broke into the sound a fight always made, the sound of men trying not to die. John moved through it ragged as wind, his sword finding gaps where gaps existed, his voice sounding calm when his heart wanted to sprint. Dickon held his line. Grey Worm's detachment in the village gave ground as planned, then folded the ground back over the Lannister defenders like a blanket until they were forced toward the water. Somewhere a herrick went up in a froth of sparks. The river took the ferries gently, as instructed, moorings cut in a way that made them drift precisely into the arc of our leverage. And when the sun finally cracked the horizon, they were in control of the crossing and the stores, and the Lannister lines had a sudden hole in them that sent any messenger who got through with the news into immediate, frantic conference. "Send word to Grey Worm," John said, wiping his blade clean and hating the way blood came off metal easier than it came off the inside of a skull. "Tell him to hold Stonehelm and not to push beyond it until he sees the smoke from Willowhithe. Then we move along the Rose Road in parallel and keep pressure without breaking what we've made." It unfolded with the inexorable logic of a storm that has decided on a particular coastline. Over the next 4 days, they took the ferry at Dunwich, making a point of capturing rather than destroying. They burned grain stores at 3 waypoints but left what they could for the villages beyond to claim. They posted men at the fords with orders to hold, harry, retreat, and return, like the tug of a tide. The Lannister forces split to answer 2 dangers that did not break and did not overextend. Just enough trouble to require twice the attention Cersei could afford. It was not only a splitting of men and wagons. Rumor did what rumor always did, turned facts into shapes with sharper teeth. Word ran into King's Landing that Daenerys Targaryen spared prisoners to take the Black, that she had a northern king who spoke for mercy, that she moved like a storm but left standing what could be made again. Word ran that Jaime Lannister had ridden through Dragonfire and lived, that he had seen a queen who could have burned his men but did not, that he had watched his men laying down their swords with relief as much as fear. Jaime returned to King's Landing under a layer of ash and silence. He stood before Cersei with that look he had when he thought there was nothing in the world but the two of them and the need not to shatter it. Cersei looked back at him as if he were speaking a foreign language and thought she knew enough words to catch the gist. "She spared Tarly," Cersei said, incredulous, peeling into scorn. "She took his son to fight for her." "She made a law," Jaime said. And people notice when a law is kept. They prefer it to wildfire. Cersei's mouth curled. The bow is sharp as a blade. People prefer bread. She is taking that. She is taking it from you, Jaime said, and for a moment he was the boy he had been, the man he was under months of grit, the brother under the husband. From us. We are the city, Cersei said, as if saying it would make it true. We are the realm. Tyrion thought the moment had come and sent Bronn to fetch his brother to a meeting at the Mudgate ferry house on a night so humid it felt like a fever. Jon went with him, wearing a cloak without sigil and a face he had not yet learned how to strip of purpose. Ghost stayed with the scouts thick along the riverbank, eyes green as bottle glass in the dark. Your raven was almost clever, Bronn told Tyrion as they waited, coin flipping idly along the knuckles of a hand practiced at such things. If you plan to keep your head on your shoulders, stop being clever. When I stop being clever, Tyrion said, peering into the dark for the outline of his brother, you'll stop getting work you can be proud of. You think I'm proud? Bronn grinned, then shrugged. I like old friends not dying. Call it what you wish. Jaime came without banner or escort, in a plain cloak and with his sword unbuckled. He saluted them with 2 fingers, an old camp habit, and looked at Jon like a man measuring a doorframe and deciding whether he'd fit through it. So you're the one who likes mercy, he said. No, Jon said. I'm the one who hates waste. Jaime's mouth twitched. You're stark enough. Tyrion's throat worked. He swallowed a dozen words at once and held the last one. We need a meeting, he said. In the open. A truce to bring proof to your queen, proof of the dead. Jon will get it. That's your plan. Jaime's face was carved exhaustion. You'll bring a monster down from a myth to stand on a stage built of lies so my sister can decide to stop lying? Yes, Tyrion said, because the alternative is fire and the alternative to that is ice, and I prefer the variety that melts in spring. Jaime turned his head away to look at the river, at how the current took the star's reflection and stretched it into a line. She will discover any reason she can use to destroy you, he said after a time. She will disease the truce. You know this, Jon said, and yet you will stand beside her. I will stand until I cannot, Jaime said, until the standing becomes a betrayal of something older. And when that happens, he did not finish the sentence. He did not have to. Help us split her lines further, Tyrion said. Not with men, with faith, with doubt. Ride to your own captains and tell them what you saw. The dragon that did not burn, the queen who did not choose blood when fear could have done the work. Tell them about dead men who walk. Some will listen. Some will only doubt a fraction more. Fraction by fraction is how a siege is won. Jaime closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He looked like a man remembering a lick of warmth in the middle of a winter that had not come yet but would. Bring your proof, he said. Give me something that will make men who have heard too many lies remember the weight of truth. We will bring it, Jon said. On Dragonstone, the wind rattled sea against rock in language too old to make much sense. Ravens clicked and shifted on their perches in the rookery, tasting the salt with tiny tongues. Jon stood in the long glow of torches in a tunnel that felt like a throat and read a letter with a hand that kept wanting to turn into a fist. Bran's words were not like any other. They were thin and direct, not because he lacked feeling but because someone had taken from him the ability to store anything private in language. He knew Jon's name. He knew what Ned had not said. He knew what Lyanna had whispered in the smell of blood and reeds, and how Rhaegar had looked when he held out a hand. Sansa's letter wrote in on warmer paper, warmer words, but the cold that had lodged beneath Jon's breastbone when he read Bran's knowing did not thaw. He went toward Daenerys with a letter in his mind and a different letter in his ha. "Indy, my sister says the things we feared are true," he said, "and things we hoped. The dead were seen on the last river. A village is gone. The weather broke early and hard. The Umbers have retreated to Last Hearth, but will not hold if the winter deepens so quickly. She asks for grain and men. She says Arya is with her. Your sisters," Daenerys said, and there was relief in it, and something like shame for having asked the word from him while so much else pressed. Your family. My family, Jon said. He felt the other knowledge like another letter folded beneath the visible one, crisp edges under his breath. I go north to take the proof you need. I will take those who will go with me. The proof we need, Daenerys said softly, uncorrected but not delayed. Yora will go. Men who have seen your dead once will always offer to see them again, as if familiarity is protection. Grey Worm cannot leave his line. Dickon Tarly asked for this before you did. Jon looked up. It surprised him into a real smile, sharp and grateful and quickly stowed. He asked to go beyond the wall? He said, if I am to serve the realm, I'd better see what's trying to eat it, Daenerys said. He said it with his hands shaking. He'll do, Jon said. They went. Gendry came with a hammer he loved like a woman and laughed like a boy and ran as if his legs were half spring. Tormund came with a roll of his shoulders and a joke that was only half a joke about how he'd feed Jon to the bear if the bear came first. Randyll Tarly came because his son did, because the shape of duty had changed and he did not know how to wear any cloak but this. They went along the glittering throat of the world until the frost turned the inside of their lungs to glass and the breath they let out made no difference to the cold. The first dead man they saw was twice dead and not enough. Tormund put an axe through him and the body kept walking until Jon took his head. The head tried to scream. The scream stayed in its mouth like snow stays on a branch. Randyll Tarly made a sound like a prayer and like a curse, then pressed 2 fingers to the little charm of the 7 he wore under his leathers as if it had warmed against his skin. Do you believe me now? Jon asked quietly after the thud of limp limbs and the frantic breathing of men counting themselves. Randyll did not look at him. I believed you when the field smelled like a roasting that would not stop, he said. I am here because it is not enough to believe. My wife taught me that. She said belief without work is the habit of lazy men. He swallowed and his Adam's apple went up and down like a man drowning's last stroking. My son believes too many things easily. I will not have him die a fool in service of one more. He is the opposite of a fool, Jon said. He will do what is right though his father burns. Randyll's mouth twitched. It might have been a smile once in a warmer room. They made it to the lake as the sky tore itself open with no noise and then stitched itself shut again with even less sound. The horrid quiet of heavy weather. The lake held them because it was too early in the winter to support weight in the middle and too late to be simple water. They were trapped on an island of rock while the dead assembled to do their patient work. They killed a walker and made their white proof with a chain, and the cold did its slow, furious work in everyone's fingers. Ravens went hungry because the horses were too careful to die where a bird could take them. The bear came first and Yora stood against it because Yora had always been a man who stood against large things and let the small things steal his sleep. The bear fell in a heap that stank of the open grave. Then men came and more men, moving like a tide that did not know the moon. When the ice cracked under Dickon's right foot, he did not cry out. And Jon loved him a little for it and then hated himself for loving him because men he loved died more often than can be explained by chance. Tormund's roar when the white hands seized his leg woke the whole frozen world and roused the pacing thing with wings that sat in a blue king like a jewel. The dragon's first exhalation turned night into a story told by grandmothers and children who had never seen burning clothes. Down! Jon shouted, voice hoarse, voice useless. The dragon made a landing like an avalanche and Daenerys was a brightness in a place that had forgotten what warm meant. She braced herself on the saddle, eyes taking in everything and deciding faster than speech. Her hand went to Jon, and then to where the line was failing, and then to where Yora was half submerged, half fighting, and then to where Dickon heaved at the chain that tethered their proof while the white tried to gnaw his glove through. Jon saw the decision made that could have been 100 different decisions. He jumped toward it. Go, he said to her. Take them. Get on the dragon, she said back. She reached down a hand, and it was both a queen's command and a woman's plea. Behind her, the men groaned and heaved and hands became red things that hurt. Go, Jon said again. I will hold them. I won't be far behind. He thought then of how lies quit being lies if a part of them believed themselves as true. He thought of the cold. He thought of a wall inside himself that had stopped needing mortar because it had become part of his bone. He went toward the eastern edge because it was where the ice looked thickest and the dead looked thinnest. He cut and cut and cut. The world narrowed to wrist, shoulder, breath, cut. The sound of a spear leaving a hand. The sound of a chain dragged over ice. The sound of Grey Worm's voice in his memory saying hold, without ever using the word. Dickon Tarley hauled the white onto the dragon's back with Gendry's help, jaw clenched, face pale. He lobbed the chain to Jon so that for a second it looked like the two of them were bound to one another. Cross a gap. Jon threw it back and laughed once, hard and brief, because men found the stupidest things to laugh at when they were closest to being not men anymore. Randyll Tarley stood at the dragon's flank with his sword in his left hand and his right hand on Daenerys's boot, steadying her as if she were his sovereign, as if the gesture were older than any oath he had ever spoken. Then he let go and faced the coming dead. The Blue King came down and took Viserion out of the sky with a spear of ice that made a sound no one could forget once they had heard it. The dragon's scream went through bone like fever. Daenerys made a noise like birth and death combined and would have turned back if Yora's hand had not closed around her wrist. Ghost howled. Jon felt the sound in his teeth. It became no longer a battle but a leaving. They left Tormund because he wouldn't leave until the last of the last had quit the island, and by then he was bound in ice up to his chest. His face contorted. His swear words blasphemies toward a god he did not believe in. Then they unbound him with dragonfire, and he fell into the dragon's hold like a sack that still muttered. They left a piece of Jon's cloak and a piece of his breath. They left the sound a dragon makes when it dies. Jon turned and turned and cut, and when his legs stopped remembering how to stop, they remembered only how to fall. He woke in a ship that was a room that was a body moving without his consent. He woke to a smell of salt and smoke that was not battlefield smoke. He woke to Daenerys watching him as if she had been waking in the rhythm of his breath and to the knowledge in her face that lives somewhere between oath and decision. "I cannot have children," she said, as if they had been speaking and this was the next line, and there was no reason to draw attention to the gap between one scene and another. "They told me so. The witch, the blood, the ashes." Jon's mouth was dry. "Maybe she was a liar," he said. "It was only mostly about the witch. Maybe everything we think we know is a little wrong." She stared at him as if he had said he could make summer last an extra day. Then her mouth did what it did when she was ready to be something other than queen for a heartbeat. "Maybe," she said. She reached forward and took his hand and laid it between both of hers. Her palms were very warm. "Your hand feels like something I thought I had forgotten." He thought of the letter under the letter. He did not say it. He did not know how to carry it without breaking other things he still needed, like her, like battle lines that were not only lines on a table. They brought the proof to King's Landing under a truce that was like a glass bridge. It held, it trembled, it cracked a little under each step. The dragon pit was not what it had been, and theirs were not the same dragons that had once been broken here. Their white gave them the performance they required, and Cersei gave them the performance she had practiced since she was a girl hating things she had been told to adore. She said she would send men north. She did not mean it. Jaime believed she could be made to and discovered instead that he could be made to be something else. He left the city on a horse that moved like a thing pushing through syrup. He did not look back. Half of the captains whose faith had been shaken by rumor and mercy found that this was the moment the tremble became a shiver they could not ignore. They peeled off from the Lannister main and took their men west on roads they had meant to take back in spring and simply failed to lift their hands to then. Splitting lines is often the work of a dragon, and sometimes it is the work of two brothers who cannot entirely become strangers. Sansa held Winterfell with a competence that made the men around her go quiet, and the women feel the relief that rolls through a tent when someone who knows the dates of everything's birth slows her speech to their pace. Arya stalked the halls with steps so soft the rushes didn't move, and the knives at her hips were like punctuation marks that made every conversation she walked into shorter. Bran looked through windows and birds, and once, and only once, through Jon's eyes for the half-second it took Jon to feel naked in a new way and put his hand flat against a cold wall to make it stop. Sam arrived with Gilly and a baby and a face determined to act as though he had planned every step of his stumbled journey. He arrived with a sword in a bundle and a story in his mouth and a tremble in his hands that only stopped when he put his palm against the wood of the library table and felt it steady him. When Randall saw the sword, he was silent for so long the hearth fire seemed to dim under the weight of it. "I took it," Sam said in one breathless stream, as if to outrun the old shame. "I knew you would never give it to me. I knew you thought I'd never be a man. But I've been a man in ways you never imagined needing. I thought I needed the sword for that. I see now I didn't. But I took it. And I'll keep it only if the realm needs it more than you do." Randall's face did a thing faces do only once or twice, where they go through too many emotions at once and end someplace few can manage to sustain. "You saved men with it?" he said. It was nothing like a military question. It was more like a prayer rephrased into a practical shape.
Sam nodded, stammering.
"Yes, when we could. Sometimes books saved more. But yes." Randall straightened. His wife would have recognized the sign. A decision made so cleanly you could see daylight around its edges. "Then the sword is yours," he said, and closed his eyes as if he had just jumped from a height into deep water. "You are the realm's man in this matter. Do not disgrace the steel." Sam forgot how to stand for a heartbeat and sat down hard on a stool he had not aimed for. Gilly hid her smile in the baby's soft hair. Dickon watched his brother with a pride that looked like a light someone had set on a hill. They trained the winter levy under Randall's eye and Brienne's and John's, and it made some men better and most men less likely to die stupidly. They set the dragonglass blades Missandei's quick mathematic hands planned and Gendry's stubborn arm forged into crates that looked like steps to the end of the world. They brought in grain where Daenerys had not burned it and where Cersei had not already taken it. They turned old stone storehouses into places that smelled like warm bread at least once a week so that men would remember what they were holding their spears for. When the dead came, they came in the way a bad dream comes after a too long day. Not more surprising for having been feared. They came in a white so white the world's color retreated to places humans had no access to. They came with giant hammers made of ice that fell like logic, and with a silence sometimes shattered by a high-layered keening that made men think of wolves the way old wives made children think of wolves to keep them from wandering after dark. They came everywhere at once and exactly where the rules of the ground allowed them to best undo what men had learned to do on it. The battle for Winterfell was not beautiful because battles are not, but it had shape. It had the kind of shape that comes from men and women who made decisions beforehand and agreed to keep to them even when their lungs burned and their eyes blurred and their knees thought about refusing service. Ghost went where Jon went until Ghost decided to go where Ghost could do the most good, which turned out to be along the inner Bailey's shadow line, where the width of the path made it a bottleneck and where a white wolf the size of the other's myths could make even myths hesitate. Randall commanded the southern approach with a prudence that would have bored a bard and saved 300 lives most listeners would have thought not worth attending to. Brienne held the western gate until the gate looked like a mouth with too many teeth broken, and then she held the people behind it, which is different and harder. Arya slipped along the inside of stone and air like a rumor made flesh. She killed the things that tried to be hidden in the places where killing them prevented larger, worse things. Sansa stood in the crypt as still as iron and made breathing schedules, the little trick of do not cry until someone has stopped, that old nursemaids teach and queens must learn to impose. Missandei counted hours and bread loaves and lives saved by the simple arithmetic of feeding men before their hands shook too hard to hold spoons. Jon faced the Blue King because it seemed like the kind of thing he would do and because prophesy has a way of taking men for fools. He did not win by skill. He did not win by magic. He won because Bran sent a knowledge along a path that was neither raven nor man, and he took that knowledge into his hands and did the thing that needed doing while others bled to give him 3 more breaths than he had had a moment before. The Blue King broke as a pattern breaks when a child smears it with a wet thumb. For a second the world wept with relief. For a second after that, the weeping froze and fell like sleet, because sometimes the body remembers too late that it is allowed to let go. They counted the living. They counted the dead. They set the pyres and Daenerys stood with her hand in Jon's, and their hands were warm and their eyes were dry because sometimes tears are not the language grief speaks in. When the last flame went down, the air felt emptied of something that had been there since before most of them had words to name it. They slept because the body forces sleep when waking no longer has anything to push against. In the morning, the wind smelled of animals and bread and wood smoke and men, which is to say it smelled like a world that could be made to go on. There were letters to be written and sent. There were stores to ration. There were graves to mark and names to carve. There was a queen to be obeyed or reimagined and a secret to be let out into the air or kept in the chest a while longer. The truce with Cersei did not survive the spring thaw, but the lines of Lannister power were already divided in a way that made it less a war and more a matter of the city deciding whether to be taken or to open itself like a seed does. Small shutter, a crack, a green thing that is not much to look at until it is. Euron took the sea like a man who had made marriage to a storm and then died of boredom with her. He sank 2 of Daenerys' ships and killed men whose names mattered to their mothers. Qyburn made more weapons that made more man-shaped holes where men used to be. Cersei sent for wildfire like a child for sweets and discovered what age had done to the recipe. More bitter, more unpredictable. They brought their army south along roads Jon had learned on a map, learned under stars, learned under a dragon's shadow. Dickon Tarly rode at their flank for the last time he would, because vows made in ash find their consequences in green places. Randall wrote to his lady and told her there were olive groves in the reach his men had kept from burning. He told her that the sword she would never again see in his hands was doing work for the people they had once ignored when arguing about their own meals. He told her, unbelievably, incomprehensibly, that he had come to admire a queen who had never prayed in their sept and never would. When they reached King's Landing, Jaime had already taken the western gates because gates fall open for certain faces when the men behind them have made up their minds before they're asked for their hands. The city had argued with itself during the winter and prepared itself to pretend that it had always intended to do whatever it did next. It took 3 days for them to cut the lines that still fed the Red Keep. It took less than an hour for Cersei to decide whether to torch the city or to let the city bury her with it. In the end, she chose a third thing, a surrender that looked enough like defiance to keep the shape of herself intact a little longer. They found the caches of wildfire, yes. They found Tyrell coins, yes. They found the places where Qyburn had sketched things that would have worked if the materials of the world were less perverse. They found Cersei in the throne room, ambient and alone, with a look on her face that said she had invented sorrow and wanted recognition for it. Daenerys walked toward her on feet that had learned how to be both heavy and light. Jon stood at her shoulder, exactly 1 pace back, exactly where he had trained himself to stand so that the idea of himself could fit into the idea of her. Tyrion approached the throne as one approaches a tall cliff when the tide is high. "You will not roast me," Cersei said. She made it a dare because it was the only way to keep it from sounding like the plea it was. "You advocate mercy. You are in love with a story about yourself that will not tolerate fire at its end." Daenerys' mouth did something odd around the word love, as if tasting a coin to find out if it is counterfeit. "I will not roast you," she said, "because it is a waste, because the world does not need more smoke, because I have learned to make laws instead." Cersei laughed, brittle and dangerous as the edges of broken glass. "You will write a law in fire and then say the ink was something else. You will take what you want under gentler names. You will be me with better hair." "I will be me," Daenerys said, "and you will be what is left for me to be when I have chosen not to be you." They did not kill her. They did not let her go. They imprisoned her in a room without maps and made the days pass in measures of bread and the necessary privacy. Qyburn died in a stairwell with 3 of his ideas. Euron died with a sword in his hand and a curse at the weather in his mouth. The city shook itself like a dog coming up from water, and the way its fur lay after was different in ways no one could have predicted. When it was done, when the dragon was on a tower and not in the street, when the city ate bread that tasted like flour and not fear, when the lists of the dead had stopped getting longer faster than the lists of the living could get shorter, there was the question of thrones, there was the question of names, there was a secret folded under the everyday. Sam told Jon the truth in a room that smelled like ink and old leather and the faint, honest sweat of men who had been on roads too long. He told him gently and with the humor men use like oil on hinges that no longer want to move. Jon stood with his hands at his sides and felt the angles of himself rearrange, the old walls adjusting, the new doors prepared or not prepared to be opened. Daenerys already knew because Varys had made it his last real work to split a different line than the ones they had split on the river. It had not been malice. It had been the old spider's habit of handing out knowledge like weapons and then trying to keep his fingers from getting cut. "Does it change anything?" she asked, later, in the dark. The candle was a small bravery that made the room intimate and kind. "Does it change who you are?" "I don't know," Jon said. "The truth has its own shape. It changes words. It does not change the winter." She laughed a little and then did not. "Then perhaps we will let the winter become something that can be changed." She reached for his hand and he gave it to her. Fingers interlaced is a way to share missing parts. The realm made a council because the realm has always preferred to make large decisions with many voices so that no one voice could be blamed too perfectly when the future discovered its new faults. Sansa came south with her hair bound up like a woman who had decided never to be a girl again. Arya came with a face that looked more like her own than it had in a while. Bran came without his body entirely and with it simultaneously. The lords who could come came. The lords who could not sent men who could speak their speech. They made a queen of Daenerys and a king of no one else. The north they left to Sansa, because the north likes to be left and because Sansa had the voice of a woman who would not tolerate being told too many times. Jon was named to command the queen's host, and Tyrion was named to speak into her ear, and Missandei was named to count their breath. Randall rode north to take charge of the work along the wall, no longer a commander of things that moved quickly, but of stones and ice and the steady patience that keeps men from doing too much when too much would be worse than too little. Dickon went with him because vows brought men strange joys when kept. Sam became the beginning of a grand Maester the Citadel would be forced to pretend it had invented. Gilly put books in order and then put men in order and discovered that the second task was easier. Brienne wrote oaths in ink so that men could put their names beneath them with hands that finally stopped shaking. Jaime rode to places where men required a certain face to tell them that things had been decided and that their throwing themselves into the past would not reverse it. He slept under trees more often than under roofs, and if he dreamed of a river and a woman and a set of choices he had made wrong, he kept the dreaming to himself and let the daylight do its work. They remembered the moment on the ash field when Jon had spoken and Daenerys had decided. It became a story that parents told when a child was old enough to ask why one way had been chosen and not another. It became a hinge in history, the point at which splitting lines had become less a tactic than a philosophy. Split the lines of fear, split the lines of ignorance, split the lines of how power tells itself it must be used. In the gods' wood at Winterfell, the bark of the heart. Tree bled the way it always had. Snow fell despite spring, because the north does not much care what the calendar says. Jon stood with Ghost pressed into his knee and Daenerys' hand in his and listened to the quiet as if it were a song made for two people and any fox that happened to pass through and wish to hear it. He did not know if peace was a thing that could last longer than a season. He did not know if the law would hold through the next set of men's absurdities. He only knew that the man he was had been taught to hold the winter, and that the woman beside him had been teaching herself to hold the fire without becoming it. Was it enough? She asked suddenly, as if reading a doubt he had not even told himself he had. When we spared those men, when we split their lines instead of burning them away. It had to be, he said. The world has to be made that way, with the things we do because we must and the things we do because we can live with ourselves after. If we did something we couldn't live with then, we'd have to keep doing it to make the first time make sense. She made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been a breath. Then let us not begin anything we cannot undo, she said. The wind moved in the leaves like the quiet speech of the old gods, and the voice of the heart tree creaked, and Ghost's ears twitched toward some distant sound Jon could not hear. The future moved like something waking slowly and not yet deciding whether it would rise. In the south, men learned to keep laws they did not like because the laws kept them from worse things they hated. In the north, women learned not to let the men tell them what laws should exist. In the middle, maps were amended and a dragon's wing shadow sometimes reminded the stone of what could be done to it but had not been. Randall Tarley wrote to his wife that there was a beauty in ice he had never before had time to look at properly, that patience could be forged as firmly as steel if one were willing to stand in cold long enough, that he had come to understand mercy as a discipline rather than a weakness. Sam wrote to his father less often and discovered one day that the letter he was writing had no flinch in it, only an ordinary son's complaint about ordinary winter. When men spoke of the war at the Blackwater, they did not speak anymore of wildfire only. They spoke of the split of the lines, the way the ferries had drifted into hands that did not cut their ropes to let them dash themselves to splinters on rocks. They spoke of how carts had been turned aside instead of burned, of how roads had been blocked without being salted with bodies so that men could move again later with fewer ghosts. They spoke of a mercy that had not broken the world's neck but had taught it to look a different way. John slept sometimes, and when he did, he dreamed without snow. Sometimes he dreamed of grass, high as his thigh and moving in wind. Sometimes he dreamed of a river that separated two fields that were ready for planting and a boy and his father on the bank, arguing softly about the depth of the water. In the dream, the boy did not step before he looked. In the dream, the father held out a hand that was not a command but an offer. In the dream, somewhere far away, a woman laughed and it was not a weapon. He woke to Daenerys's hand at his jaw and ghosts grumble at the foot of the bed and the feeling that the things they had chosen had become, for this hour and perhaps for a few more, the kind of past that warms instead of burns. The world would grow cold again. The world would go hot. He had a cloak. He had a queen. He had the understanding that mercy is a road and not a destination, and that splitting lines is sometimes the only way to knit a torn thing back together. Not by forcing the edges to meet where they don't, but by giving each side space to become itself until they can belong anew. On a morning when frost lay in a silver mesh across the winter wheat, he walked the outer wall with Randall Tarley and they spoke of trivialities. Salt for the soup, boots for the men, whether a certain section of stone minded thaw and freeze too much and needed reinforcing. They did not mention dragons. They did not mention thrones. They did not mention the way both of their names had been altered by letters that had come too late and too hard. They nodded at the men who nodded at them. They came to a halt where the wind cut sharpest and watched the white breath of the world rise. "I was wrong," Randall said, without preamble and without interest in making it a speech. "About the boy I beat into a man who had other ways of becoming one. About the queen I judged without seeing. About the wall I left too late and kept too long." He met John's eyes. "I am trying not to be wrong in a way that my grandchildren can recognize when they are old enough to judge me." John did not look away. "That is all any of us can do," he said. Then, because the wind had its own harsh humor and his face hurt from it, he added, "And keep our ears from frostbite." Randall snorted. For a second, John thought he would smile, and then he did, and it looked like a door that had been stuck for years finally yielding to a shove. "That too," Randall said. They stood a time longer, counting breaths not because they wanted to be sure there would be another, but because counting them was a way to mark the life they had. Then they went into soup that was better than it had a right to be and to letters that had to be answered and to the day's work. Outside, the wind gave the wall its usual sermon. Inside, the fire minded its business. In between, men moved back and forth and did not always fail to be worthy of the work. By late summer, the Rose Road was green again in places and brown where wagons had chewed it despite care, and there were children who had been babies when the dead marched who were now walking and falling and getting back up again in courtyards where banners had once hung limp with fear. There were lovers who forgot for a whole day to talk about which house they belonged to. There were men who took their meals at tables that had never been served to women before and did not choke on the bread. There were women who stood up in rooms that had always required them to sit and said, "No," and then "yes," and then "how." There was a queen who rode sometimes without her crown and sometimes with it, who learned the names of the children she met and the mothers of those children and the trades of those mothers and sometimes the names of the fathers and often the histories of the walls of the houses they kept those children in. There was a king who was not a... There were people who forgot the details but kept the shape of it, and fathers who told their sons that sometimes the way to prove a point is not to force it until it screams, and sons who told their fathers that sometimes the stranger you hate is a better friend than the familiarity that is killing you. There were mothers who told their daughters to make mercy a habit before it had to be a strategy. There were daughters who decided to make laws before men had to be convinced to obey them. The winter had taken what it demanded. The summer would take what it could. The autumn and spring would do their own negotiations with time. The world would not cease being itself because men had found a way to change a few lines. But there were more birds than before in the trees along the Blackwater. There were more boats. There were more bakehouses. There were fewer men in fields trying to make corpses into statements. There were more statements made in ink. On a day when the sea was very loud against the rocks of Dragonstone, Jon stood with Daenerys on the height above the painted table room and watched the world extend itself into distance. He did not know what their children would be or if they would be. He did not know if the council would become something lazy later, if he and Sansa would find themselves into one of the older quarrels the North loves, if Missandei would marry and stop counting and start counting differently. He knew only the feel of the wind on his face and the way his hand fit around hers and the weight of a sword at his side that had cut and would have to be cleaned again, like laws do, like mercy does. "What if we had burned them?" Daenerys said, not answering any of the things he had not said. "What if I had let the smoke make my argument for me?" "Then the wind would still be blowing," Jon said, "but it would stink more." She laughed then, a laugh that belonged to the girl she had been and the woman she had made out of the girl. "I prefer this wind," she said. "Let's keep it this way." They went down into the long, low room with the map of their world. They set their hands on the places where they were needed. They spoke of grain and roads and ferry ropes. They spoke of letters and walls and the patience of stone. They spoke of a boy and a father on a riverbank. They spoke of mercy and what it makes of people who choose it and people who receive it. They spoke and had the unoriginal luck to mean it, and for a while and then for longer the speaking held.